Graaf Generator. Although not as talked about as other English prog bands like Yes, Genesis, King Crimson, etc., they have formed their own unique sound and has garnered a big fan base. And in this video, I want to talk about my personal history with the band while talking about some of their big albums. So if you're a fan of Graaf Generator, please give the video a like, subscribe to the channel if you are new, and let's jump right into it. Bryer's Music Showcase is brought to you by the people over at Patreon. Pledge today and get access to exclusive perks. Link in the description. Welcome to Bryer's Music Showcase. I am Bryer and welcome back to another video. So Graaf Generator. I have a history with this band. They're actually one of the earliest prog bands I checked out when I was just starting to get into the genre, along with Gentle Giants and all the big names, we all know them. But Graaf Generator was one of those bands I had a hard time getting into. And there's a couple reasons, and that's stuff I'll talk about as we progress. But I want to quickly talk about these albums that I have in my hand right here. So I own pretty much all their albums from their first album up to the final album from 1977. And as we talk about these albums, I'll talk about some little history. This ain't like a forgotten music history video. I'm not going to go too in depth here, but I'll talk about the history a little bit, and I'll talk about each album and my thoughts on them, and we'll kind of go from there. So the band got their start. It's a very confusing history, I must say, so I'm going to try and simplify this as best I can, but again, I'm not an expert here. But basically, probably the most notable member you need to know is Peter Hammill, who is essentially the main songwriter, and he's basically the leader in a sense. And another big figure, and let me just pull up his name for a sec, just make sure I don't forget. And the other guy's name was Chris Judge Smith. So those two were the main leaders, I guess, in a way. And I think it was Chris who decided to name the band Graaf Generator after the actual Graaf Generator. I guess it makes for a cool band name. But they got all the musicians together, and they would get signed to Mercury Records, but almost immediately the band essentially broke up for various reasons. And so Peter decided to kind of keep going because he was still signed to the label, and he wanted to do a solo album. And who did he get to play on the album? Not other than a lot of the members for Graaf Generator. So once the album was done, after striking a deal, they decided to turn that Peter Hammill solo album into the band's debut album. And we have the Aerosol Grey Machine from 1969. And this album tends to fall into one of those categories where the debut is kind of seen as a novelty or kind of a weird oddity where it's not really that essential to listen to, but if you're just curious. And this is definitely an interesting debut album. I can see the seeds on where the band is going to go, but again, there's still some things they got to iron out because this is pretty much all over the place, I would say. But the one big consistent on this album is definitely the vocals from Peter Hammill. And that was definitely one of the first hurdles I had because Peter Hammill has a very unique vocal style. I can't really describe it. You just gotta hear it for yourself, but there's like some kind of aggression to it, but still has a very youthful sort of anger. There's like angst to it, which again, took me off guard. But we'll see as it goes on where it really starts to kind of become more up my liking in a sense. One thing I should also point out about this CD copy is that they kind of added a few more tracks because I think the original album only had 9 songs, but here they expanded it a bit more, and I think they changed the track listing a little bit. But you have interesting stuff like Afterwards, Running Back. Then you have probably the most notable song to most people, and that's Octopus. I think that's also a pretty solid song. But then you have the weird interlude with the title track, which is this weird jaunty I don't know what you say, carnival, or I don't know. This has this very upbeat nature that seems very out of place here. But I guess it's still interesting. But I wouldn't say this is one you need to listen to first. I think you should listen to other albums before you get to here. But again, only if you're curious. So after that, they decided to keep it going here, and it wasn't until the second album where I think the band found their true sound. And the next album is 1970's The Least We Can Do Is Wave to Each Other. And as you can see, they also have the Graaf Generator on the cover. And so I hear some fans kind of say this is probably the actual debut album, which, I guess I can't really argue with that. And they switched labels by this point. Now they're on Charisma. And I think they're one of the first acts to be signed to Charisma, if I'm not mistaken. Of course, Linda's Farm would join, and then Genesis would also join. So I think that's kind of cool. So I think this is a big step up from the debut. And I should also mention the musicianship, because I think that's another big highlight I do enjoy about this band. It's because you have Hugh Batten, who is on organs, piano, and backing vocals. You have Nick Potter, who is on bass and also a little bit of guitars. Guy Evans, who is on drums and percussion. And David Jackson on tenor and alto sax, flute, and other backing vocals. So that's another interesting thing about Graaf Generator that makes them stand out. Even though I just said there's a little bit of guitars, I would not say they're a very guitar-heavy band. I would say the horns is definitely the mainstay, because that causes that more aggression, that drama into the music. And that's another thing I really enjoy about the band that I eventually grew to enjoy, is just how dramatic everything sounds. Like, everything sounds like it's very dark and very brooding. I kind of like that sort of sound. So onto this album though. Again, like I said, big step up. You have songs like Darkness, Refugee, White Hammer, After the Flood. There's a big grandiose nature to this one that's a bit more finalized. But I will say my only nitpick of this album is that some of the songs do kind of sound a bit samey after a bit. That's something I can kind of give a point to the debut. At least there's a bit more variety on this one. But there's definitely a vibe that they're trying to go for on this one, and I can respect that. But like I said, I think this is definitely where you should probably start. Well, one of the albums you should start with. But still, very nice follow-up. And the band continues on. We have 1970 again. They released 2 albums in the same year. We have, and this is going to be a pain to say, H to He, Who Am the Only One. Of course, H referring to hydrogen, and then He to helium. And I guess they're going for a space theme, I guess. Because you have this very interesting, spaceship. I don't actually know what's going on here. It's an odd album cover, but still kind of on the same plane as the last one. They're still kind of really exploring the sound here, and I think they're pretty much on par with each other. Songs like Killer is pretty good, House with No Door. The Emperor in His War Home, I also think is a very strong, very good song on this one. And I think Robert Fripp guests on one of the songs of it, I think. Of course, Robert Fripp from King Crimson, which I think is pretty cool. Okay, I could look through this one, but I'm not sure if this is going to actually be upfront about it. Not really at the moment, but I'm pretty sure. Actually, no. Yeah, Emperor. There we go. Once I said I was not going to look for it, it just popped up. But still a very solid album. Not much else to add. Again, very much on the same plane as the last one. But then we get to this album, which to some people, this is kind of seen as the band's masterpiece, if you will. We have Pawn Arts from 1971. And yeah, I can definitely say this is definitely one of my favorites, honestly. I think by this point they really are honing in, and then you have some epic songs on here. It has a very similar structure to Close to the Edge by Yes, where there's only 3 songs. But each song, I think, has some really stellar moments. Lemmings is great. Man Erg, kind of an interesting title, but still very nice. But then you have the big epic song on here, and that's A Plague of Lighthouse Keepers, where there's many different sections on here. And I think Robert Fripp yet again guests on guitar on the song. It's just a very, very fascinating album. And this is where Peter Hamill's vocals really, I guess to me, they really start to shine a lot more. Because you have that very bigger, very darker sound, and I think it's just really plays off really well. And again, the horns on here is fantastic, and some great organ and keyboard work. I think this is definitely one you should probably check out if you want to get into the band. Daunting, especially if you're a newbie to progressive rock, but I think still definitely one you must listen to. And this is where the history gets even more kind of interesting. So one thing I should probably point out, these 4 albums really were not good sellers. Not at all, really. I mean, yeah, they had a fan base. They had like a more cult following. But in terms of the mainstream, yeah, these albums were not doing it. Again, it comes down to some of the reasons I mentioned before. Again, the music is very dark sounding, which to some is not really their cup of tea. And like I said, Peter Hamill's vocals can be a turnoff to some. But because of those reasons, the band has decided to think, I think the band's done. And that was it for a number of years. And during that time, Peter Hamill would release some solo albums. And as of this recording, I have not listened to any of them, though people said they're pretty good. But the thing is about Peter Hamill's solo albums is that he would occasionally bring in some of the members from Graaf and kind of help him out. So I think it's cool they kind of had a good relationship. But eventually in 1975, I guess Peter Hamill thought, hey, you know what? I think Graaf Generator deserves a comeback. And lo and behold, they return with 1975, God Bluff. Pretty plain cover, but still. So you essentially have all the main guys back in the band. You still got Peter Hamill, of course you would. And then you still have Hugh Batten on here. David Jackson's on here too. And Guy Evans. I should also point out at some point Nick Potter left, but you have pretty much everyone else. You have Hugh Batten basically doing double duty with organ and bass. And to me, this is definitely up there. Like my top 2 Graaf Generator albums are Pawn Hearts and this album. It's kind of hard. I don't really know which one I prefer more, but one thing I can give this album, I think this has some of Peter Hamill's best vocal work, because there's like anger to this album, and I think Peter's vocals really shine. They really emphasize that more angsty, very very angry sort of sound. And there's only 4 songs. You have the Undercover Man, Scorched Earth, Arrow, and the Sleepwalkers. I think this is definitely a standout, and definitely a great way for the band to come back with. Again, the horns just add to the atmosphere with the organ and slight guitars. It's just a very, very strong album. So I really would recommend this one. And then they would follow it up with 1976 with Still Life, and I think it's a pretty solid follow-up to God Bluff. Maybe not as good as God Bluff, but there's still some good moments on here. Pilgrims is pretty well liked from a lot of fans. Still, the title track's nice. Childlike Faith in Childhood's End. Again, kind of on the same plane as what we've heard before. But still, I quite like this one quite a bit. I just don't have much else to say. I will say I do like the album cover. There's something very fascinating about it. But things start to get a little interesting. We have World Record, which also came out in 76. And this is where I feel like they're starting to lose a little bit of steam. Again, there's still some nice moments here and there, but I don't find this album quite as memorable as some of the other stuff I talked about. Only 5 songs again, and again, there's moments on here, but I don't know. This one didn't quite live up to some of the other ones. But still, all the elements are still there. And of course, this is kind of when this classic lineup of the band would kind of fall apart, because 2 members ended up leaving. Hugh Batten, who of course has done all the organs and piano stuff, and the bass for that matter. And then David Jackson decided to leave too, who has also done all the horns. So what does Peter do but decide to carry on? So we have 1977's The Quiet Zone / The Pleasure Dome. We're a long way from home. Welcome to the Pleasure Dome. No, not that Pleasure Dome. So this is an interesting album. For one, they kind of changed the name. Instead of Graaf Generator, they're just called Graaf, which I guess makes sense because it's less to say, but yet there's something missing. I don't know, kind of a weird choice. But Peter decided to not really replace David Jackson. Like, there's no designated horn player, although I will say David's still kind of here. He does play saxophone on a couple songs, but he decided to replace the horns and even the organ playing for that matter with a violin player, which is kind of odd. I don't quite fully enjoy that. I mean, the violin playing's nice. It was done by a guy named Graham Smith. Man, there's a lot of Smiths in this story. And also you have Nick Potter coming back on bass, which is kind of interesting. But any case, other than that, yeah, I'm not really a fan. I think this is probably my least favorite. Well, one of the least, it's either the debut or this one, where would rank kind of low in terms of this period. Again, still had some decent moments, but I don't know. The violin in Graaf Generator just doesn't really work for me. It works for Kansas, but I don't think it works for Graaf Generator. But that's just me, though. And then, after this, the band would break up again for many years, for a few decades. And then I think they came back together in 2005, and they released maybe like 2 more albums. I don't own them, so I'm not going to talk about them, but if they're worth getting, let me know in the comments. But there you have it. That's pretty much a brief kind of overview of the band. So like I said, it's kind of an interesting journey I've been through, kind of getting into Graaf Generator. I still wouldn't say they're like my big all-time favorite band of progressive rock, but it was definitely interesting. And I think the more times I've listened to the band, they've definitely grown on me. You know, I can acknowledge there's some great playing, some great horns, great organ playing, and Peter Hamill's vocals, like I said, weren't really my thing originally, but the more you give it more chances, it does kind of resonate with you, and you kind of hear the emotion that he brings to the table. And there's some very interesting lyrics, very doomy, kind of dark, but I kind of like that sort of thing, so it does kind of is under my wheelhouse. But other than that, I really dig it. I really dig this band quite a bit. So let me know in the comments, what is your history with Graaf Generator? And you can let me know your thoughts on any of these albums, and you can also let me know which one is your favorite if you're more versed in this catalog than I am. And other than that, that's pretty much going to do it for me. We'll see what band I want to talk about next in these like more simpler type of videos. Give the video a like, subscribe to the channel if you are new, and I will see you in the next video. Take care and goodbye for now.